So a very warm welcome to the last New Testament research seminar of Lent term. And I just remind you of what I've also included in the email invitation, namely that the seminar will be recorded and made available on the Faculty Seminars YouTube page, so that those who would like to remain anonymous are advised to switch off their camera and send their question on the paper to me in the chat, so that I can read it out anonymously. If no objections are received today after the seminar, in the case that you are dissatisfied with the quality of your own question, but unless we receive such an objection, we will also include the Q&A. So today we are very privileged to have one of the leading experts on the Gospel as ancient biography. The name is, of course, Bond, Helen Bond, and like the other Bond, she is from the north. She studied in St. Andrews and for a PhD with Jimmy Dunn in Durham, and is currently, since some years, at Edinburgh. Professor Bond has established herself as a scholar on the Gospel of Mark, even on the prosopography of important characters in the Gospels, such as notably Pontius Pilate, the topic of her PhD thesis. And furthering her interest in Mark, has also edited a book that's coming out soon, isn't it, these weeks, that argues for the Johannine revision of Mark. It is excellent to have Professor Bond conclude our short diptych on the Gospels as ancient biographies, because whereas scholars such as C.H. Talbot and Richard Burridge have argued for the Gospels as ancient biographies on generic grounds, they have never really applied it to the actual Gospels. And it is Professor Bond who has first demonstrated how this works for the Gospel of Mark. And her book was published last year. We are therefore extremely pleased that she will summarize her findings and arguments in her own words in today's paper. And we are very much looking forward to it. Helen, the digital floor is yours.
Thank you very much, George. That's very kind of you. So I will attempt to do the share screen. There's always that moment, isn't there, where people see whether it's actually going to work. Oh, there. I think is that looking okay?
Absolutely.
You can all see it. Okay, great. So yes, thank you very much. And this is all very strange. I'm very glad that I can see some of you, some friendly faces down the right-hand side of my screen, because I'm sitting here in my kitchen just talking to myself, or at least talking to a computer and moving slides along, which is a very strange thing to be doing. But I will keep focusing on the faces and remind myself that I am sort of virtually in Cambridge here. So yes, as George said, I published a book just almost a year ago on reading Mark as a biography. I'm having trouble moving my slides. That's it. It seemed to me that while there was a general consensus nowadays that the Gospels are ancient bioi, and that had been the result of quite a large dispute in the 70s and 80s. By the 90s, people have broadly decided that the Gospels were bioi. But to my mind, it seemed as though people had just stopped asking questions about genre just as this got interesting. Because if the Gospels are biographies, then this is a great discovery. This is something really worth mining and finding out the implications. What does this say in terms of how we understand the Gospel? How does it compare to other Gospels? Essentially, so what? That's what I wanted to know. You know, what difference? Why did people spend all of that time looking at the genre of Mark? Surely it's got to make a difference. So that's what I set myself to do. And largely what I did was to compare Mark with other Greek bioi, particularly biographies of philosophers, because it's Greek biographies of philosophers, I think, that Mark has most in common with. And we're very lucky that there are a lot of Greek biographies left still extant. And so I spent several years reading through these biographies and reading the secondary literature. In terms of ancient biographies, I was very lucky actually in that there's been a surge of interest in biographies amongst classicists since around about the 1980s. Prior to that, people used to read biographies looking for historical details, and often biographies failed to give the details that people were looking for. And so classicists tended to be a little sort of dismissive of biographers. They were failed historians. They were not really sort of very high level literature. Since the 1980s, though, there's been really quite a change, and people are starting to see biographers as sophisticated authors, and to see biography itself as an art form. And a really useful book is this one on the screen here by Thomas Haig, The Art of Biography in Antiquity, published by CUP in 2012. And Haig, who's, sadly died now, but was an expert, first of all, in Greek novels and then biography. And his work sort of goes through different biographers from the very beginning of the art form right through to the hagiographies of the 3rd and 4th century. So a very useful book. And the kind of biographies I was comparing with Mark were people like Isocrates and Xenophon from sort of very, very early days. Also Plutarch from the early 2nd century, Philostratus and Diogenes Laertius from the 3rd century. Philo of Alexandria, of course, is really useful as a Jewish biographer. Josephus is there in brackets because although he didn't produce a biography and his life is not in any shape or form like a biography, but he did structure the beginning of his Antiquities as a series of biographies of great men, sort of bio-structured history, as Christopher Pelling calls it. And so he's actually useful as well. I found also found some useful bits and pieces in Tacitus and Cornelius Nepos, although obviously they are Latin biographers. So that's sort of the group of works that I'm largely working with. So in terms of ancient biographies themselves, there are clearly a whole range of different biographies, and they cover almost a huge spectrum. Some are funny and entertaining, some are much more serious, they're different lengths, there's all kinds of differences amongst them, as you would expect. I mean, it's a very fluid genre, and sometimes it incorporates elements from other genres too. But I suppose the one thing that biographies all have in common is that they are memorials. They're memorials to a great man. I don't think I found any memorials to a great woman, but they are memorials to great men, and perhaps more importantly, how that man should be remembered. That's, I suppose, fairly similar to our own biographies today. But another feature of ancient biographies is that they're very interested in character, and characters as the bearers of certain virtues, sometimes vices, but more commonly, I think, presenting the hero as a bearer of certain virtues. And the point of that is because they have a moralistic purpose. They tend to set out the hero's way of life as a model to be imitated. So as I got very interested in biography, actually, and looking at sort of biography through the ages, and it seems to me that they're quite similar to the kind of thing that you got in the Victorian age, you know, where it's sort of the great hero, Nelson or whoever it is, sort of set up as the brave and great hero, and young boys at school would sort of read about Nelson and then model their lives on him. So it's that kind of thing, very much about providing a model for the readers. Quite often they have an interest in the death of the individual. Not always. Some biographies don't mention the hero's death at all. But the really interesting thing about death is that death is the one point in someone's life when you can be sure that they are not masquerading. And I think that's why death sort of takes on a particularly important aspect in ancient biography, because this is where you get the real person. And so that they're, you know, the clearest window onto the person's life. And another aspect that I found really interesting actually working on this was that they have a degree of fictionalization. I'm somebody who's always interested in this sort of comparison between theological truth and facticity and how you sort of square these things up. But one of the things I found out about biography is that fiction is sort of almost part of the genre. And in a way it has to be, because there's quite a high level of selectivity. If you're wanting to present a character as the bearer of virtues, obviously you select the things that are going to help your argument, you quietly drop the ones that don't. And Plutarch makes this very clear in his writing. He admits to doing that. In terms of the death, you know, you might want to emphasize certain things, drop other things. And you can see in Suetonius's writing that his characters have the death that they deserve. Their death is perfectly in keeping with their character. So again, you've got a degree of tweaking with your narrative. Also, we'll see in a moment that they're largely made up of anecdotes, and anecdotes, I think, almost by their nature, can often become quite fictionalized. And again, we're all very familiar with this idea of, you know, writing somebody's obituary, and you have an anecdote. You're not sure if it really fits or not. I mean, you're not sure if it's really historical or not. You know, sometimes you suspect that perhaps it's not, but you might want to add it anyway because it so perfectly sums up that person's character. Plutarch says what we're trying to do here is to expose the person's soul. It's to try and expose the person's character. And so even things that aren't, strictly speaking, historical, I think, can find their way into biographies simply because they expose the person's character in a way that perhaps other more blander stories might not have done. So turning to Mark then as a biographer, just a few sort of broad points. The first is fairly obvious. If we're seeing Mark as a biographer, then we're clearly seeing him as an ancient author. And that means that he's had a Greek education, he's had a certain level of education. And I found it very interesting reading lots of stuff on education and trying to sort of plot where he might be in that whole sort of ancient education system. Clearly, he's somebody who can write creae, the anecdotes. I think he's probably got some familiarity with the sort of lower levels of the progymnasmata, but he's somebody who is able to write a biography. People have often pointed to Mark's Gospel and noted what they see as elements of orality there. So the use of threes, for example, chiasms, the summaries, things like that. And I think they are there, but what I would prefer to see them as is Mark's aping a colloquial tone. I think Mark knows that his writing is going to be heard by a largely illiterate audience. And I think he adopts this sort of very sort of colloquial way of expressing his message. So lots of kai parataxis, lots of present tense. It's a very lively, engaging way of writing. And my guess is that it's deliberate. Of course, most biographers would quote from Homer, or at least show their awareness of the great literary tradition of the Greeks. Mark, of course, doesn't do that. What he does is to ape the language and style of the Septuagint, and he quotes from the Septuagint. So I think that's one of the important differences between Mark's work and other biographies. at all times, I think his language and thought world is coming from the Hebrew scriptures, even if the genre that he's adopting for his writing is coming from the Greeks. One more broad point is that Mark's episodal structure, I think, is more important than people often suppose. By which I mean, of course, that his structure in which it's one pericope, as they're usually called, or anecdote after another. And I think this explains his structure to some extent. His structure is to have groups of similar stories. So you have a group of miracles, a group of parables, a group of agonistic stories, and all the way through he's sort of grouping his stories until you come to the passion narrative, and then he takes a chronological approach. This, of course, has often been analysed by people who are interested in pre-Markan traditions, thinking that Mark has perhaps a pre-existing group of miracles or a pre-existing passion narrative. And whilst I don't want to, whilst it seems perfectly clear to me that Mark has all sorts of sources behind him, I'm far more reticent than a lot of people about trying to work out what these sources might have been. I think there's a huge amount of Mark working over his material here, and this sort of structure of having topical arrangement followed by a chronological arrangement is actually found in other biographies. It's found in Suetonius, for example, who also likes a topical arrangement, and a lot of Greek biographies of philosophers don't have any kind of a structure at all. So Mark actually has more structure than most, but it's, again, not at all unusual for a biography. So in the remaining time, I want to talk about three things that I found interesting in terms of comparing Mark with other biographies. And the first is Mark's portrait of Jesus. Second is what that does to other characters. And the third is a few reflections on Mark's death of Jesus. First of all, then, Mark's portrait of Jesus. Ancient character tended to show rather than tell. So although you do get some biographies that sort of say, you know, he was a man of great virtue, he was pious, and then give an example, and, you know, he was self-restrained, and then give an example, more commonly, they tend to just show the character in action, and we are to draw our own ideas from that. And when I say character, I mean character and identity, because I'm not sure that people would have made the same distinction between the two that we do today. So the first thing that I think Mark shows us here is Jesus's father and his fatherland. When I was reading through Diogenes Laertius, he has this great expanse of philosophers from the earliest days up to his present. I mean, it's in many, many books. He has hundreds of these philosophers, and some of them are just tiny, tiny, very short accounts. But in all of them, the things that he always mentions are who is the father and where does the person come from. And Mark does this too. A lot of biographers don't say anything about birth and early years, particularly in a philosopher. I think that's not particularly strange. But Mark, like other biographers, tells us where Jesus is from. He comes from Nazareth, and also tells us who the father is. And again, I think if you read the baptism scene as an adoption, that shows you who Mark thinks Jesus's father is. So right from the start, although Mark knows something of Jesus's earthly family, he knows he has a mother called Mary and brothers and sisters. Right from the start, we see that Jesus is adopted by God and infused by the Spirit for the work ahead of him. So as Jesus goes along, we see a certain amount of other traits. So in the miracles, for example, we see this spirit-possessed Jesus acting with power. We see him as a benefactor, showing compassion to those who come to him and ask for his aid. There's also a measure of self-control here. There's sort of beggars who keep on, Jesus, Jesus, come and help me, blind Bartimaeus. But Jesus always is self-controlled in response. All of those controversy stories that the gospel is full with, again, show Jesus's authority. They show Jesus as top dog in this agonistic world of male debate. And again, this hostility and envy that the controversies instill in people is, again, a very strong biographical trope, this idea that that your enemies are envious of you. And in this Mediterranean world of honor and shame, of course, it's not at all surprising that this hostility, extreme hostility, is going to lead to Jesus's death. And the use of Son of Man, I think, Jesus's preferred title for himself, fits in with other traits that you get in the gospel too, particularly, I think, a certain degree of modesty and restraint and secrecy. And all of this, I think, is a refusal to accept honor, which I think fits in very well with that central body of teaching about self-denial and putting yourself last. So Mark presents this picture of Jesus, who is an embodiment of all of these virtues. But at the same time, there's a very strong message in Mark's gospel to follow me, and this idea of imitation. Jesus provides a model for people to emulate. So Jesus says, follow me. Also, the structure of the gospel, I think, it invites us to emulate Jesus. So we start with the baptism, where all of the Christian journeys begin. And right at the end of the gospel, in the empty tomb, we have the young man at the tomb saying, inviting people to go ahead of him to go back to Galilee. So the story is going to start again. It's an invitation to start again now that we know the whole story, and to model yourself on Jesus. There's also, and it's commonly been noted, this sort of threefold structure in the gospel, whereby John the Baptist comes, preaches, and is executed. Jesus comes, preaches, and is executed. And it's clear from chapter 13 that followers too are expected to preach and may well stand trial and may well expect to be executed themselves. So there's this kind of threefold pattern in Mark's gospel, which again underlines that idea of imitation. And this, you may think this is a little bit out there, and I'm just throwing it out to see what you think. But I was struck actually by there's no physical appearance of Jesus in Mark's gospel. And that is quite strange. Most biographies tended to, I mean, by no means all, but often they do. And when I thought more about no physical appearance, we're not told his age. He's in many ways quite genderless. There's no mention of a wife or a family. And I wonder whether, it does seem to me that in terms of character, the more you want a character to act as a model, the more you have to kind of wipe out the idiosyncrasies. And I wonder whether this sort of slightly rubbed out Jesus is, and the lack of specific things like a physical appearance is all part of this theme of imitation. But, I'm not wedded to that. If you want to suggest other reasons, that's fine. So that's what I think is happening with Jesus in Mark's gospel. I said I wanted to look at other characters too. Of course, since the 70s or so, there's been a big interest in characters amongst New Testament scholars, particularly with the work of the narrative critics. But narrative critics tend to treat the gospel as a short story. And I think don't take enough notice of the episodic narrative, the fact that it is made up of these small chunks, and many characters only appear once, and are confined, imprisoned in their own pericope. So I think that makes it very difficult to draw narrative arcs and to say, to talk of character development across the scenes. In fact, other episodic narratives actually generally don't tend to have very much character development at all. Even finding a plot is actually quite difficult. They tend to have very sort of very straightforward plot lines, I suppose, because the nature of episodic narratives doesn't necessarily help there. And so I wanted to think a little bit about the disciples, who are probably the most written about group of other characters in Mark's gospel. And the reason for that is probably because they are very ambiguous. They don't represent a consistent portrait at all. And so they seem sort of, every time you think you've got a handle on the disciples, they seem to just kind of disappear through your fingers. But I think part of the problem is that I think people are looking at the disciples and expecting them to be the model for hearers or readers. And I think that's where it doesn't work. So rather than seeing the disciples as model disciples, if you see them as foils for Jesus, then I think things slot into place much more easily. So what I'm suggesting is that rather than look at the disciples for pictures of how we as readers or hearers should behave, the point is that we look at Jesus for models of how to behave. And the disciples' role is simply to aid and abet that portrait of Jesus. So what I think is that the disciples kind of present themselves in three different blocks across the gospel. At first, in those early chapters, again, the disciples are acting as foils to Jesus in these early stories. And what they're doing there is allowing Jesus to be seen as an exemplary and authoritative teacher. So he's gathering a group of loyal followers around him. They stand up for him, he stands up for them. They're always doing the right thing in these early chapters. And of course, in some ways, they stand there for sort of metaphors for the church later on, which will similarly be gathered around Jesus. In the middle section, though, their function changes a little bit. And now I think they act as questioners. They're allowing Jesus to explain his teaching more fully. Again, this is something that you do get in other biographies, particularly, I think, Philostratus's Life of Apollonius of Tyana. Their Damis, the sort of head disciple, is quite similar to Peter. I suppose because Mark is quite short, you get more questioning in Mark than would be normal in any of these other biographies. But still, I think the disciples there are acting as literary tropes. They're asking questions so that Jesus can explain himself more fully. And then as we move to the third section, or the Passion narrative, now I think Mark has to get the disciples off the scene because he wants the spotlight to fall solely on Jesus. And now I think by running away, they allow the spotlight to fall solely on Jesus, and so underlining his courage and lonely salvific death. So again, I think there's sort of these three different phases throughout the gospel in which the disciples are being used in different ways. But what links them all is that in each case, they're reflecting back onto the central character of Jesus. There's not time to look at other characters, but minor characters like blind Bartimaeus have come into their own lately, with narrative critics in particular suggesting that whilst the disciples have are really not great as examples and show how not to behave, it's these minor characters who actually show us what discipleship actually entails. I would want to say, rather than that, I think these minor characters show us some aspect of kingdom behavior, if you can put it like that. So someone like blind Bartimaeus perhaps exemplifies hope and persistence. The unnamed woman who anoints Jesus, the sort of profligate generosity. I think in each of these cases, they show us something, some attribute that, that is expected of disciples, but in no way are they kind of the full representation. Because I think for Mark, nobody can be. It's very much a question of following Jesus. And that brings me to the third thing I wanted to talk about, the death of Jesus. Oops. It's important to remember, I think, that Mark's is the longest account of a crucifixion that we have from antiquity. And that's something I think we really need to keep reminding ourselves, because we're so familiar with some of these texts sometimes that we need to remember that Mark could have told this story differently, but he chose to tell it this particular way. Ancients, of course, had a very clear idea of what constituted a good death. So Achilles on the battlefield, Iphigenia going nobly to her death because of the vow of her father. And of course, the greatest example of all, Socrates, undergoing a state execution, but in perfect calm and accepting the hemlock almost gleefully. And Socrates' death, of course, was the great model in antiquity, followed by Cato the Younger and Seneca. What's interesting, I think, in many of these examples of good deaths is that they occur in a context of failure. So failure itself didn't necessarily deprive you of a good death. It could actually provide a context which then allowed you to shine as you died in a noble way. Conversely, of course, ancients also had a very clear idea of what constituted a bad death. There was lots of sniveling and female-like behavior, running away, all the opposite things to a good death. But what's most important in all of this is how the story is told. To go back to Suetonius's biography again, and his deaths of the emperors, sometimes it's only a few references. You just need to talk about somebody's nobility of spirit, their calmness. Conversely, you need to talk about their sniveling, their running away. It's very easy, I think, to move from a good death to a bad death. It's just a question of a few details. And we see that already with Luke's representation of Jesus's death, where he adds a few details that transform it. And of course, John transforms Mark's death of Jesus completely. So what I'm wanting to emphasize here is that it's about the way you tell the story, and sometimes just a few details can make all the difference. When it comes to philosophers, there's clearly an expectation that a philosopher's death should be in keeping with their teaching. So a good death for a philosopher legitimates their philosophy. And this is probably what you would expect, because philosophy is all about living a good life. And so if it doesn't help you with death, then what's the point, in a way? But Lucian's Demonax and Peregrinus show us two different ways here in which a philosopher can meet his end. So Demonax was Lucian's teacher, and he has a good end. He knows when his hour has come, he knows it's the end, and he stops eating, he calmly waits for death, and it takes him. Peregrinus, on the other hand, the passing of Peregrinus, dies this horrible, showy, ridiculous death. He throws himself on a pyre, and Lucian is mocking him intensely because he thinks this is a ridiculous end to a ridiculous life. But the important thing in all of this is that your death should match your teaching. And when that happens, then that's the mark of a good philosopher. Sometimes, of course, you get what are called philosophical martyrs, those who die for their teaching. Often, too, you get different deaths in circulation, competing accounts. Most of the time, the biographer will simply choose which account of the death best fits his or her purposes. But one of the things I like about Diogenes Laertius is that he gathers everything together. So in the case of his philosophers, he'll give us several accounts of their deaths, often competing accounts, and he simply records them all. But you can imagine that people who, that friends and allies and disciples of a philosopher would likely give a more positive picture of his death, whereas those who were opposed to him would probably give a less flattering account. Crucifixion, of course, was the most shameful of deaths, and Cicero describes it as the greatest punishment of slavery. So this connection between crucifixion and slavery was an important one in the ancient world. I'm assuming again that there were several competing accounts of Jesus's death in circulation, some of which were much more noble, perhaps a martyr type account, some of them perhaps less so. Mark clearly is indebted to an account that draws from Psalm 21. Of course, that psalm keeps coming to the surface in his account of Jesus's death. And what's striking about Mark's account of Jesus's death, I think, is the extent to which he emphasizes Jesus's shame. So the Mark in Jesus is almost entirely passive at the end. This sort of vibrant Jesus who's been moving quickly around Galilee, combating opponents wherever he goes and besting them with ease, becomes progressively passive, so that in front of Pilate he says 2 words, and that's all he says until right at the end. The theme of mockery, too, is really, really strong throughout Mark's trial narratives, and even more so as we move onto the cross. The sense of abandonment, too. Everybody deserts Jesus, even apparently God at the end. So this is a miserable, bad end. I don't think there's there's very, very few redeeming features here. Of course, Jesus goes to Jerusalem. It's a death he embraces, but it is a bad end. It's a slave's end. And the question is, why? How does that fit into Mark's overall picture? Well, I think Mark composed his gospel backwards in many ways. He started with the death of Jesus. Like I say, it could have been described in different ways. He could have made it much, much briefer. But of course, the death of Jesus is at the very heart of Christian teaching, and it's something that he had to wrestle with. So rather than minimize Jesus's death, it seems to me that he went all out on the shame and the slavery angle. And to counter that, he composed a body of countercultural teaching in the middle of his gospel, this long journey that he makes to Jerusalem in 822 to 1052. And throughout this body of teaching, Jesus is continually turning the conventional ideas of honor and shame on their head. So what counts for honor now in this new Christian community that's growing up around him is very different to what counts as honor in the Greco-Roman world. Disciples are called on to deny themselves, to give up everything, including perhaps their lives if necessary. And Jesus makes it very clear that true honor and prestige in this new community that's growing up around Jesus lies in embracing ignominious service and disgrace. So it's all about being as a servant or a slave to one another, self-denial. And important to remember, of course, that this too is a Markan literary creation. This central body of teaching, I think, is designed to match the cross at the end. And what Mark shows by doing this is that Jesus lives out this teaching in his death. He goes willingly to Jerusalem and he submits to the will of God, but through his death, he perfectly enacts this teaching in the middle of the gospel. And of course, Jesus's passion narrative is full of these biographical tropes. I noticed many of these biographies talk about the hero knowing when the end has come. This is clearly something that that is thought of as a good thing in a biographical hero. You know, to know when your hour of death is upon you, and this idea of envy too, that the opponents are envious of Jesus. So all kinds of traditional biographical tropes there too, but for Mark, I think there's this really close connection between the teaching in the middle of the gospel and his ignominious death. So Jesus's meaning then for Mark, Jesus's death then has meaning for Mark, and I'm not at all wanting to say that it doesn't. It has really important meaning that comes from the rich heritage of his Jewish scriptures. He sees Jesus's death as a ransom for many and as a new covenant. But it's also a model, I think, of service and self-denial in the same way that Jesus's entire life has been a model for followers. So there's no mismatch then between Jesus's teaching and his manner of death. And of course, if Mark is writing at a time of persecution, as is often suggested, and one that I have a lot of sympathy with, then I think this has extra relevance. And this realistic picture of Jesus encountering his death, I think, is one that would prove very useful to Mark's hearers. Of course, in the grand scheme of things, this is not the last word for Mark. He shows that Jesus has this ignominious death, but at the same time, he's wanting to undercut that. So there's a series of prodigies when Jesus, prodigies when Jesus dies. For example, the darkness, which I think is a solar eclipse, which often heralds the death of a king. There's the tearing of the temple veil, showing divine judgment. And of course, if Mark is writing some years after the destruction of the temple, then that would take on added relevance. There's a centurion's confession when he sees Jesus's death. And again, there's been a big discussion about this lately amongst Markan scholars. Is this a true confession? Is it to be seen as sarcastic? And I think, again, looking at Mark as a biography, this is a very common trope, the idea that the jailers or the executioners, those who are on the wrong side, but who know the hero intimately because of their connection with him, the suggestion that they are converted or they confess him as innocent or whatever at the end is a very common one. And so it seems to me more likely that we are to see the centurion's confession as a true and genuine confession. And of course, there's the whole ironic level that's playing out here. Jesus is being crucified as King of the Jews. And of course, those with eyes to see recognize that he truly is the king. And also the imagery of the triumph that several people, I think, in recent years have seen lying behind this whole procession to Calvary. And of course, the disappearance of the body, when the women go back to the tomb on the Sunday, the body is gone, which I think to Greco-Roman minds would mean that Jesus is now up in heaven. And Mark, of course, interprets this as a resurrection. So Mark gives his Jesus this terrible death, but at the same time, I think he's undercutting it by all of these other elements that show us that despite appearances, despite Jesus's terrible death on the cross, which Mark does nothing to try and obliterate, those with eyes to see can actually see something different there. So for Mark, I think Jesus dies a philosopher's death, obedient to God and to his teaching. Just as importantly, though, the cross is the logical end when a life of service and humility is pushed to its end. And of course, Mark's account then became the basis for all subsequent narrative retellings. Everybody wrestled with Mark's account and how and what to do with it. I've already mentioned Luke tried to cast it in a rather more noble framework, and John just rewrote it completely. So just a final reflection. It seems to me that biography is a very specific reception of Jesus' tradition. I'm assuming, as I've said, that there's lots of traditions, lots of stories, some of them written, some of them oral, but casting the material in a biography is a very specific way of dealing with it and presenting it to other people. I think seeing Mark as a biography is different to the form critical approach, which to my mind sort of chopped things up too much. But also different to a narrative way of looking at the gospel, which again, to my mind, didn't chop it up enough. Those episodes, I think, are an important aspect of the biography. I think it stresses Mark as a creative author, working with older material and transforming it into something new. Perhaps most importantly of all, though, I think Mark's decision to write a biography of Jesus, whether he was the first or not, and clearly we can't know that, but what Mark is doing, I think, is extending gospel or euangelion to include the life as well as the death of Jesus. So previously, I think gospel had been the good news of Jesus's death and resurrection. What Mark is saying, though, is that the beginning of the gospel is the life of Jesus, and that the life of Jesus is gospel too, and that the life of Jesus is important to Christians. Thank you very much.
Well, there's a silent applause, I'm sure, and it's absolutely splendid, Helen. I think today we have seen the definitive treatment of Mark. It makes so much sense, doesn't it? And impressive that you presented it in only 45 or 60 minutes and showed how important the application is of the genre of ancient biography for a fuller understanding of Mark. And all those subtle remarks about the usefulness of your approach to solve many unresolved issues in research, such as orality, topical arrangement, silence about birth, the importance of controversies, etc., full with very interesting remarks, Mark having the longest account of crucifixion in antiquity. So we are very grateful indeed for your presentation. And I'm sure that it will make people want to read your book all the more. So I very much look forward to a discussion, and it will be helpful if people signal their questions just briefly in a chat, either in the group or to me, so that I will be able to make it somewhat fluid And if you want me to read out the question, in case you want to remain anonymous, just say so, and I will try to translate it into a shorter version. So I see Tom Habib, I think, presenting himself for a question. Yes.
There were a few people before me though, George.
Yeah, I just saw you popping up. So just take advantage of being my PhD student.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Bond. That was very interesting, very helpful. I'm interested in how you understand the similarity in tropes between biography and the Gospel of Mark. Do you consider the similarity to also be a similarity in how they function? So, for example, you mentioned origin and the baptism scene, thinking about where someone comes from. And for example, in Plutarch, I guess Plutarch is interested in childhood and education because he wants to see how virtue develops and is learned. But I guess I would see a different reason for introducing origin and where Jesus comes from in the baptism. That seems to be more about divine identity. So I guess I'm just interested, how far do we take these similarities in tropes? Are you suggesting that similarity is also in how they function as well?
Yeah, thank you. That's an interesting question. I actually didn't find very many connections with Plutarch so much, which was really annoying given the length of Plutarch. I think, yeah, I mean, what I meant by that is that I was looking really to see, you know, everybody says, or lots of people, all the people who doubt the whole biographical thing say, well, you know, there's no account of Jesus as Jesus's birth or as a youngster in Mark, and that's really strange. In Greek biographies of philosophers, I don't think that is particularly strange. A lot of, you know, as I said, a lot of them don't have anything to do with the birth or the youth. They really just get going at the point when, you know, the subject sort of becomes a philosopher or decides to take himself off and do his philosophical thing. So I was looking for what sort of the minimum that you tend to need to sort of ground a person, and I was quite struck by the fact that nearly always you're told where they're from and who the father is. And I think there's good reasons for that in terms of ancient characterization, in that, you know, certain places were thought to be to have certain characteristics, and part of you, of course, is coming from your family, and so that's why you needed to know who the father was, and the clan and the kin and that kind of thing. So I think it may just be that, you know, those were expectations. If you're going to to write a biography, there's an expectation that you say, you know, Jesus is from Nazareth, and that you give some account of who the father is. And the progymnasmatic, I can never get my head around this, but, you know, the grammarians are quite useful in terms of giving some account of what do you do if people come from inauspicious backgrounds. And I think it's Theon who says, you know, well, you can really make a feature of this and say, you know, they came from humble backgrounds, but they actually, you know, turned out to be great people. And, you know, and there are traditions about Socrates coming from sort of low birth, and I think Mark could have gone along that line. He could have said, you know, his father was Joseph, he was a carpenter, he was sort of nothing all that special. But he doesn't. I think he gives him this hugely important paternity, and right from the start, he says he's the Son of God. And I think the baptism scene is showing us how he comes to be Son of God. It's because the Spirit comes into him at the baptism. So I'm not wanting to, I you know, there's always that temptation when you're sort of in comparative stuff like this, that you push things too far, and you may all be sitting there thinking, I've done that anyway. But I don't want to kind of say, well, this is what happens, so this is how you interpret Mark. But I just think that an audience who are used to biography would expect, as a very bare minimum, that you get to know where Jesus is from and who his father is. And I think Mark does give us those things right at the beginning.
Thank you.
Getting to the proper cue, Christopher Yedan, the first speaker of this term, has a question about school traditions.
Yeah, thank you very much for this marvelous presentation. As a philosopher, it was hugely illuminating and convincing. My question, though, is about an apparent, say, mismatch or difference between philosophical biographies and Mark. And it perhaps connects to what Thomas said. So in these philosophical biographies, we see this characterization of the, let's say, initiation of the moment the philosopher got hooked onto philosophy as very important, and also you might say, the pedigree of schooling. So the school someone attended, the tradition someone is standing in. Now, these elements arguably seem not so important in Mark. One might say, now my question to you, is this either a willful deviation from the template to say, for theological reasons, Jesus was fully formed teacher himself and John the Baptist just the backdrop? Or would you conversely read more into the baptism scene?
That's a really interesting question. Yeah, I'm not wanting to push too much. I mean, I think the genre, the housing for this story is coming from the Greco-Roman genre of biography. But of course, there's also that huge element of the Jewish tradition that's also being drawn in there. So in terms of school, I would say probably the school is everything that you get from the Septuagint. You know, Jesus is that I mean, we start with a quotation from Isaiah, composite Isaiah, and I think that's just keying into all of that tradition. That's a school. That's where he's coming from. But of course, Jesus is something completely kind of new, and so it's a one-off. It's something different. So yes, I mean, you're right. When people do tell about sort of the early years of philosophers, it tends to be who was the teacher, who taught them, where they're coming from, and that's what Diogenes Laertius does a lot. But no, I think the school, if insofar as Mark thinks like that, is that whole tradition of the Jewish scriptures.
Dagmar Winter.
Thank you.
Hi.
Thank you for a hugely stimulating paper, and Andy Myers is going to ask a question a little later that I'm also one of many questions I would like to ask. So I can just ask one. What light does that throw, what you've said about biography, what light do you think that throws on the ending of Mark's gospel, especially the vexed questions whether he actually had a fully spelt out resurrection narrative or not?
Yeah, well, I can only offer thoughts on this, but I don't think he needs anything more. I mean, of course, the difficulty is that as far as we know, Mark is the first, or at least the first extant. I mean, I wouldn't be at all surprised if people had a go at sort of in a biographical way earlier, and Q, insofar as it's sort of usually put together, has a kind of a biographical coloring to it. So Mark may not have been the first, but still I think there's no expectation at this point of what a gospel, a written life of Jesus is going to look like. I don't think it needs one. I mean, again, the grammarians suggest that, they give us sort of pointers as to if you're describing a person. They don't specifically talk about bioi, but they do say, if you're describing a person, these are the things you want to talk about, and you want to talk about their death and events after the death, by which I think they mean sort of, if there were games or, anything to do with the burial, that kind of thing. So Mark has certainly got to that stage. He's got to the death and events after the death. And I think, for me, I was very influenced actually by this idea of the translation fable, or, the disappearance of the body means that the person is now ascended and in the heavens, which is, I think, where Mark thinks Jesus is now, sort of ready to come back. So I do think that you don't really need anything more. Jesus has died, the tomb is empty, it's been interpreted as a resurrection, God has raised him, and it's clear from the fact that the body isn't there that he's in the heavens. And of course Jesus's prophecies have all made that very clear too, that he's going to be on the right hand of God, ready to come back. So I don't think you need anything more. Clearly later authors thought, well, we can just really underline this. We can have a picture of Jesus appearing again. But my guess is that that's where it was always going to end. And that ambiguity as well is, it is so typical of Mark. Mystery is at the heart of Mark. I think Mark never quite allows you to pin anything down, and that sort of slightly odd ending, and he has a slightly odd beginning too. So I see that as being not necessary for anything more. But you don't look entirely convinced.
Would you like to come back, Dagmar?
Well, I was just thinking that right at the start, actually, there's a very, very distinct and clear summary, isn't there, at the start of Mark's Gospel of what this Gospel is all about. And so I wouldn't say that there's complete mystery from the start in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, I did spend quite a bit of time sort of looking at how biographies typically finished, and I mean, they are, by our standards, they're not very satisfying. They often have a line that, and everything was fine afterwards, and their progeny lived well and prospered. They don't necessarily kind of wrap things up to the extent that we would have them wrapped up. So again, it's, yeah, I mean, who knows? But I don't think you have to have something there.
Next is David de Vol.
Okay, am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay. First off, thank you very much for this very intriguing and very well-grounded paper. I was very impressed. My question is related to Thomas's about Jesus's relation to God, and also related to the mystery trope in Mark. I'm not a New Testament scholar, but one thing that I am aware of about Mark is the famous messianic secret trope. The mystery about Jesus's identity that goes until chapter 8, when Peter says that he's the Son of God, and then he again acknowledges that he is the Messiah in his trial. So I'm wondering about how this mystery or ambiguity about Jesus's identity and these sort of two moments of revelation would fit into your discussion of Jesus's being cloaked in this biographical way when the very identity of this figure is itself kind of ambiguous.
Yes, it is ambiguous. I mean, obviously this is a literary product, so we are watching the unfolding of a literary thing. So I think there are, I mean, I think there are moments of great clarity, as Dagmar just said. He opens very clearly. We know exactly who Jesus is, but we don't necessarily know the full implications of what it means to be Christ and Son of God. And so we have to sort of watch the story unfold. And Jesus starts off in this sort of, I would say, actually quite sort of elite male way. I mean, he's the sort of top dog, and he's a benefactor, and he's contrasted with King Herod, and then you sort of move into this this sort of the sort of self-denial, and things change as he gets to Jerusalem in the end. I mean, all the time there is this element of secrecy, though, that I think there's a level, and I link that with sort of modesty and restraint. And I think one of the difficulties is that because Jesus is someone who denies himself, and self-denial is an important thing, then you can't have a Jesus who goes about saying, I'm the Messiah. You're almost confined on a literary level to having a certain amount of secrecy and mystery, because you can't have people just sort of coming and knowing who he is from the start. But also on a theological level, nobody is going to understand this until the very end. And I don't actually think that the messianic secret, I don't really go along with the traditional view. I actually think the people that Mark is writing for, they probably, particularly the ones who aren't Jewish, they wouldn't have heard the concept of Messiah until they heard it being talked about with Jesus. So, I don't think there's a concept of Messiah that needs reinterpreting through Mark's gospel. I think he's showing in what way Jesus is the Messiah, and it involves death, and you have to sort of watch the whole thing unfold before you understand how it all hangs together. But mainly, I think the secrecy thing is a literary device to that links very closely, links with the idea of Jesus and self-denial, and also this sort of redefinition of what it means to have honor in this new community. And of course, all the time you have these evil spirits who are merrily telling everybody who Jesus is. So it's not as though we don't have those high titles in view. It's just that Jesus himself never clearly tells people who he is.
Thank you.
Anna Lefterato has got a question about the death of the philosopher.
Many thanks for this wonderful presentation. I'm a classicist, so I will ask about philosophers. You did mention that lots of philosophers try to reproduce the ideal death as part of an ideal philosophy, which is what Plato said, that life is a study of death. I wanted to invite you to think the death of Jesus, which actually fascinated me, Mark, in the terms of the death of Solon. Because what Solon said, and this was also very popular in antiquity, is that you cannot deem somebody to be happy before you see his end.
Yeah.
And I wanted to see how subversive this is in the case of Jesus. It is not his own happiness that this is reflected on his own death, but a kind of a collective happiness. Might this something be graspable from Mark's audience, or is it something that we can make sense of it a posteriori?
Thank you. That's really interesting. And I thought a lot about the death of Solon and how to bring those ideas in. And in the end, I didn't know what to do with it, to be perfectly honest. So I didn't. It is really interesting in terms of that idea that you have to have the full picture and you have to know the full story before you can judge. But I'm afraid I don't have a very good answer for you, because, like I say, I did try wrestling with that and didn't really. I'd be very interested to know if you have any reflections on that.
My feeling is that it's a subversive way of addressing the expectations of a Greco-Roman audience, that if you think that death should be a proper death, or the Solon's dignified death, in order to deem somebody happy, then certainly not something which is worthy of the Messiah. And this is where the subversion and the Jewish background comes into play.
Yeah.
And in this sense, I would be able to push it into the narrative, but it would have been something in the mind of a Greco-Roman audience of Mark's time. It's a very strong model not to think with.
Yeah, I think everything about Jesus's death is, tipping everything. All expectations are being tipped up on end, and I think that's a really strong theme. So thank you. Yes, I think that would work.
Thank you for this very broad presentation and the lovely slides.
Did you like my Jesuses?
Yes, I did.
Despite mentioning that we don't know what Jesus looked like, I know I was aware of the irony that I kept showing you pictures of what my Jesus looks like.
And the bias is next.
Hi, Helen. Thank you for your presentation. It's very clear, and I look forward to reading the book. I'm wondering about the opening line of Mark's Gospel, the incipit. And I'm just curious about your take on the use of euangelion. It can, of course, be an ancient, well, it is an ancient media term in a way, both the way it's used in the Septuagint and in early Greco-Roman writing. And it would be, in a way, convenient, of course, for your argument if Mark began with the beginning of the bios of Jesus Christ, but he says the beginning of the gospel. So in what way might gospel be used generically or as a term of genre for Mark?
Yeah, I don't think Evangelion is a genre. I think I mean, it's interesting how Mark uses Evangelion, and I did do some work on sort of looking at every use and sort of putting them in two camps. Most of the time, it seems to be that sort of oral proclamation that he's talking about, but sometimes, I mean, you know, yeah, I mean, sometimes involving Jesus more and sometimes less so, but I mean, yes, you're right. It would have been very good for my argument if Mark had started the beginning of the bios of Jesus Christ. But one of the really interesting things, I think, is why are the Gospels not called bioi by the early church? And I think the reason for that is that very quickly they were called Evangelion, and I think the reason for that, I mean, I think it's partly because of Mark's opening. I think when Mark says this, he does mean the beginning of the gospel, the proclamation about Jesus, you know, the kerygma, the beginning of the kerygma about Jesus, and wants to add the life to that. But very quickly you see it already, I think, in Matthew's gospel, where it's almost becoming a term for a written account of Jesus. And I think very, very quickly it Evangelion now sort of takes on that idea of a written life, perhaps as well as oral proclamation. And I think that's, my guess is that's why they were always referred to as Euangelia, because that, I mean, that was a better term for them. But I mean, it's interesting that Matthew and Luke both treat Mark as a biography. They both add biographical elements. They add the miraculous birth. They add the genealogy. They add the bit at the end, you know, further sort of accounts of what happens after his death. So it seems to me as though they are treating Mark as a biography. But I think the reason for them not being called bioi is simply because a better term presented itself very early, and that was Euangelia.
It seems to be a very crucial point, since two members are willing to come in, namely Simon Gerrigal and after that Mona Hooker. So they will be enriching the discussion, and then we continue with the rest of the line. So Simon first, and then Mona Hooker.
Hi, Simon.
Hi, Helen. Thanks very much, and I really enjoyed the book as well. I'm very much with you in terms of Evangelion not being a genre. But just to follow up what Andy was saying, I wonder to what extent, or how the biographical dimension contributes to to Mark's gospel being an announcement in that sense of news. So you focused quite a lot on the character of Jesus being presented by Mark, and so I was wondering in what sense, because it's quite easy to see how, you know, as per lots of other places in the New Testament, the death and resurrection of Jesus are the sort of the message, the announcement of what's happened. But how does Mark's presentation of the character of Jesus contribute to that good news?
I think by providing that ethical dimension. So it's a question of believing in the gospel, believing that, you know, God has sent Jesus for salvation, but also that then has ethical implications, and that there is this ethical level at which you model yourself on Jesus. So I think that for me is why this adds to the idea of Evangelion. So now it's broadened to belief in Jesus, but also giving you some blueprint as to how that manifests itself in your life. You know, what do you do if you're a follower of this person? And I think that's what Mark is supplying answers to. So you know, people often say there's very little in the way of ethics in Mark, but I think it's full of ethics because it's full of how you behave. And that's the way I think it's linked to the idea of euangelion.
Professor Hooker.
Hello.
I think you're still muted, but if you can unmute yourself. That's it.
Here I am.
Hi.
Hi, Helen, and thanks for that very good account of many of the important themes of Mark. I discovered that I'm still stuck in the 1980s, was it? Because I have never been persuaded that Mark can properly be described as a biography. You said at one point that if you want to write about a person, well, I imagine that's what a biographer wants to do, but it seems to me that Mark is wanting to do far more than that. And though I go along with a lot of the things that you were saying about what Mark is trying to get across, I wonder to what extent describing it as a biography focuses on those ideas any more than my own suggestion, well, following up the suggestion that we can see it as a kind of Greek tragedy, but with a splendid ending. And on this question of it being a gospel, no, there wasn't such a thing as a genre of a gospel, though it seems to me that Mark is creating it and the others follow suit. But what Mark is trying to get across is the significance of Jesus and the fact that God is working through him. You bring out the fact that Jesus is described as the adopted Son of God at the very beginning, but this important theme of his sonship runs throughout the gospel at very important points in the narrative. And finally, the ending. Yes, but surely it's much more than a kind of tying up and saying that Jesus is in heaven and get on with it, as it were. It ends with a real challenge. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is the thing about Mark's gospel. It isn't just an account of somebody's life. It's a challenge to the readers or the hearers of the gospel to follow this person and to do something with the story for themselves. Mm-hmm. That's my problem with just calling it a biography.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. I didn't in any way mean to suggest that Mark wasn't challenging by his ending. To take the ending first, I interpreted the question to mean, you know, is that the end, or was there more that's been lost? And I don't see the need for any more, but I absolutely agree with you that it's a challenge. It invites the reader in. The reader is in the situation of these frightened women running away, and the question is, how will you respond? Will you run away, or will you go to Galilee? Will you? And what's important in that, though, for me, is that the question is, will you believe what God has done in terms of salvation through his son, but also will you express that in terms of modeling your life on Jesus? So this follow me, and I think that's what biography gives you. That and you're perfectly right. You can get it without that, but it's that moralistic aspect to biography that I think then sort of gives you permission to see that as absolutely integral to the gospel, and also that puts Jesus on such a level that, as I suggested, all the other characters are foils to him in some way or another. That doesn't stop them sometimes being, acting as exemplar here and there, but it's that kind of moralistic side of things. And I've been very influenced by your work too on the death of Jesus, and the death of Jesus as a model, rather than entirely, I think there's both things. I think it has that kind of meaning from the Jewish scriptures, but it's also, it's a model of how to utterly deny yourself.
if I can just come back, does calling it a biography help? I mean, does it emphasize this aspect, or does it in a way hide something of the impact that Mark is trying to make?
To me, it heightens it. It makes it stronger because, like I say, I had always read Mark's Gospel and thought, you know, obviously that I'd noticed all the follow me and the structural sort of comparisons with Jesus. But for me, it really heightens that aspect of it that, you know, everyone says Mark's Gospel is about discipleship, and then they jump straight to the disciples. I think Mark's Gospel is about discipleship, but it's about Jesus, and Jesus is that model of discipleship. And I completely get the point. You don't need to call it a biography to get there, but by noting the fact that ancient biographies tended to be about morality, and in the case of a philosopher, what they do is sort of present the philosopher for a new audience to get to know that philosopher. They raise the philosopher from the dead almost. And so I think that's what Mark is doing here. He's presenting Jesus to this new audience so that they can encounter him and so that they can model their life on him. And I mean, I don't at all want to minimize the challenge of Mark's Gospel. This is a huge challenge, you know, be like Jesus, self-denial, go to the cross if necessary, making your choice at the empty tomb with those frightened women who have just gone. You know, I think the whole thing is mysterious and challenging, and that's why it's such an amazing text.
The next question is from David Bryan, and I want to thank him for his patience as we had this historic intermezzo that will be remembered in times to come as the Bond-Gallagher-Hooker debate. So I'm sure that within 24 hours it will be the top of the YouTube recordings. So David Bryan.
Thank you. First of all, Helen, what a fantastic seminar and a fantastic book, which I've read this last few weeks and really enjoyed.
Thank you.
I want to ask a question around Jesus as model, but before I do, I just want to make a comment about the Mark as your profile of Mark. I was struck by the way that you described him as in the second tier of Greek education. And you suggested that he deliberately had gone for a Septuagintal sort of influence rather than Homeric. And that made me think to myself, actually, you know, nowhere in Mark's Gospel does he quote a Greek or Roman author, as far as I can see, but he's always quoting Hebrew or Greek versions of Hebrew scripture. So therefore, I find myself thinking that maybe Joel Yarborough Collins and people like Joel Marcus were probably right, that Burridge's thesis was a little weak because it didn't engage with, if you like, antecedents from the Jewish world. And I wonder whether that's something you might want to come back to me on. You see, I think mimesis or imitation is also part of Hebrew scripture as well. So, you know, imitating David's virtues and trying to avoid his vices would be an important part of it. Now, my follow-on question is about Jesus as a model. Is Jesus for Mark a model learner as well as a model teacher? And where does Jesus actually learn anything in this story so that we might learn from him? I mean, I've got three things in my mind. Did he learn that he was the Son of God at baptism? Because you imply that he was adopted then. Did he learn something from the Syrophoenician woman? Because his attitude towards outsiders seems to be actually not especially generous. And maybe he learned something in trying to help the disciples follow him to the cross, because he becomes very impatient with them in that middle section of the gospel. I suppose the last thing is, did he learn that he ought not to curse fig trees?
Thank you. That's two quite big questions. So in terms of the first one, yes, I mean, absolutely. And I at one point I did sort of talk about things, I mean, in my book rather than presentation, I talked about things that an ancient reader or hero who knew about biographies would find strange about Mark's Gospel. And I probably should have said more about his use of the Septuagint. I mean, we assume you know, I mean, to have written a biography, he had to have had a certain level of education. And as far as we know from all the books, Greek education was pretty standard across the empire and used Homer. There does seem to be this big debate on whether Jewish boys would have used, were they reading the Septuagint? I mean, we don't know that. I think there's no evidence for that. But of course, it makes perfect sense that a Greek boy who's got, I mean, that a Jewish boy who's got a level of education is then going to be reading the Septuagint. And clearly, that is where Mark's whole thought world is coming from, the Septuagint. I had a student, Nathaniel Vetti, who wrote a really good PhD on how he was looking at other things from Second Temple literature and how a lot of them use the language of the Septuagint and they sort of blend it into their stories without necessarily reflecting all of those contexts, but just using, you know, reusing sort of Septuagintal language is quite common. And my guess is that Mark is doing something like that. I was also quite influenced, although after the book, by Sean Adams's work on Jewish writers and how they interact with various genres, and he talked about sort of indigenizing certain forms, and he didn't make this point with biography, but it seemed to me that it would be really interesting to see to what extent you want to call Mark perhaps a sort of indigenous Jewish version of the Greco-Roman biography, because simply because of what I was writing about, my book, I admit, ended up being very Greco-Roman, and I was very aware that I was kind of missing out on this Jewish stuff, but it does seem to me that there's been a lot of exploration of that anyway, and I was wanting to sort of highlight other things. So I probably completely lost track of your question, but for me, he's not quoting the Homer, he's quoting the Septuagint because that's his whole thought world. But also, I don't think that there are good examples in the Jewish world of life stories like this. I mean, there are biographical bits in the Jewish scriptures, but they're part of a much longer history or saga that's really to do with God and God's relationship with Israel, and that is not biography in that way. You don't get biographies of the rabbis. You only get biographies when Jews are very much interacting with Greco-Roman ideas like Philo, and Mark is a long way from Philo. I mean, on the spectrum, Philo is much more Hellenized, but Mark, I think, is combining this sort of Jewish scriptural stuff with ideas that he's found in biographies. And in terms of your second question, is Jesus a model learner? Yeah, I mean, I very much want to say that after the baptism, there's the temptation scene. I mean, Jesus is driven out by the Spirit. He has no agency in any of this. And I think one of the problems is that if you put 1:14 to 15 in a separate bit, compared to the temptation, what you miss is that he has this temptation and then he sort of emerges on the scene, having now arrived at the decision that, you know, he is going to follow the Spirit and the path that's been laid down for him. So I think that whole temptation thing is, and again, that's a very common biographical trope. You know, the hero who takes himself off to the wilderness and kind of decides where he's going with all of this. You know, is he going to follow the path of virtue or vice? So yes, I think they're Syrophoenician woman. Yes, I like to think so. I don't think Mark has a very high opinion of women generally, but I think she may be one who does teach Jesus something. And I would have to think more about the disciples, whether he learns from them. I think he learns that you have to keep telling people things lots of times before they understand it. But but again, I think, you know, that seems to me to be internalizing and sort of psychoanalyzing perhaps too much. I think they're simply kind of hooks, and their questions are hooks for Jesus's ideas and to be expressed again.
Well, that seems a very good good ending. It's 1:30. There are still a few more questions, but I think it's best to stick to time. It only indicates your provocative and inspirational paper. And thank you so much for coming to us, especially as you're also so busy as head of school. So we very much value the time that you spent with us. And thank you so much.
And thank you very much. And thanks to everyone with questions. It's always the best way to learn, isn't it? Thank you. Bye-bye.